Kelley Towne is a witch, tarot reader, author, and is located in New England. We speak on her new book, Stones in the Glade, The Old Craft in the New World. We talk about the Salem witch trials, performing magic as it was done in pre-modern America and England, spirits, tarot, and much more. If you have seen something strange or unusual, such as a cryptid, spirit, UFO, or anything in between, and you would like to be on Strange Dominions, you can send us an email at strangedominionspodcast@gmail.com. And now for our interview with Kelley Towne. And we are here with Kelley Towne, author, psychic, witch. She just came out with a new book, Stone in the Glade. We're very, very happy to have you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, I really like this book, and I like it for a lot of reasons. I like your writing style quite a lot. One of the things that I was thinking about when I was reading it was some of my favorite authors are, Robin Artisan, Gemma Gary, some of the big names in the traditional witchcraft sphere. And I love them so much because they aren't just writing a bunch of information. They're writing a story with information laid in it. And they put in a lot of world building. And there's such an atmospheric quality to their writing that really lets you imagine the world that they're building with their witchcraft. And that's exactly how I felt about this book as well.
Thank you so much. I wouldn't want to say that I'm like a next Gemma Gary or a next Robin Artisan because we're all unique in our own ways. Kind of like how I think it was Celine Dion. She was once compared to like Whitney Houston or whatever. And she said, no, I'm just me. And they're all just different singers. But thank you so much. And that's exactly what I was going for with Stones in the Glade, trying to evoke a sense of things that I've experienced in this particular glade that I would go to starting in my university years, my freshman year of college, trying to take it back to where I felt a sense of belonging, not only it being in Salem, but I felt a sense of belonging in this particular part of nature. And it's kind of like what magic is all about too, is world building. You're creating your reality through magic. It is an art through which you can do that. And in a way, this book is a work of magic. It took a long time for it to come to shelves, but I'm very happy with the result. And I really appreciate you taking the time to read it.
Absolutely. It was a real joy to read. And like I said, I love your style, and it was very informative. And it was one of these books that I feel is a great introductory to this specific kind of witchcraft, especially because, traditional spirit-based witchcraft, well, it's always been around. It's only now becoming public and more people are getting into it. Whereas, since the 50s, Wicca was the dominating form of, witchcraft. And the thing that I could never get into, I remember I had one experience with Wicca. I was 16 and my ex-girlfriend said, hey, we're starting a coven. Do you want to join our little coven? I'm like, okay, sure. So I joined, and like, okay, tonight we're going to astral project. And so I did exactly as I was told, and I ended up astral projecting to like the ice realms of Niflheim or something. And I told them, like, this isn't what you described at all. And they said, oh, well, you're doing it wrong. You're getting kicked out of the coven. You're not allowed in our coven anymore. And I said, oh. Okay, then. So, and whenever I would talk to a lot of Wiccans, like, the idea of spirits being a central part of the practice was just so alien to them. And it seems like that is a trend that follows a lot of what I would call post-industrial magical traditions. I have a friend who is very into thelema, and I could talk to him about that stuff, but I would never ask him about like traditional magic, ceremonial magic, things like that. It would just go right over his head. He didn't even know what the 3 books of occult philosophy was. And I just realized that there is a compartmentalization in modern occultism where if it doesn't have anything to do with what you're doing specifically, it's not worth learning about.
Yeah, you know what's so funny? I actually was going to make a reel on this topic because I worked magic in both ways, either with spirits and without spirits. I do feel like it's possible to do either or because magic is energy. It doesn't disregard or break the laws of physics. It is somewhat realistic. A lot of people don't see it that way, but it is. But then there's the other dimension of working with spirits and having relationships with deities, having relationships with angels, demons,
Nature spirits is, yeah.
exactly, any of those. And a lot of these magical systems, like the Thelema, ceremonial magic, a lot of them do have a direct influence on modern witchcraft. And I notice a lot of people who ask me, hey, where do I start? I'm like, read about different things. And that's mainly what I'm talking about, because if you have context from these different things, like, for example, Aleister Crowley and Gerald Gardner, I read once that they actually did know each other. And Crowley actually influenced early Wicca, the first book of Shadows, but then came figures like Doreen Valiente, who wrote over and got rid of a lot of the stuff that Crowley contributed, probably because Crowley had a stigma around him. They called him the most wicked man on earth or something, even though that wasn't really the case. He was just, he might have been a little out there with his ideas, but he wasn't as deviant as people thought he was. Maybe he was just, it was just a product of the time for people to call him like a deviant or whatever, but he really wasn't. And I think a lot of that got swept under the rug, and a lot of people forget that that's where a lot of this stuff connects. See, other practices that aren't necessarily witchcraft, like voodoo or Santeria, they're still magical systems. It doesn't mean you should write it off entirely. You should still learn about it and get some semblance of what it's all about, because magic is a universal practice. A lot of cultures have had it through thousands of years. There was always that one person in the village or the tribe that knew a lot of this stuff, who could heal people, but also put curses and hexes on people when all other means of justice failed. But all in all, going back to the whole thing with, you know, spirits and witchcraft, I feel like your example of astral projecting into one of the realms in Norse mythology, I don't even think you could do that wrong. Because again, a lot of these are very, you experience them in different ways. I might experience Folkvanger differently than you do, and that's okay. As long as the general schema is there, I wouldn't say that you're doing it wrong unless you're going to Tartarus or something and for Greece.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, you know, that was just when I was 16 and they were 16 too. So they didn't know what they were talking about. But yeah, you know, your early experiences definitely color a lot of how you view things, you know, later on. So yeah, what I'm really curious about is growing up in New England. What was your experience like living there in relation to witchcraft, the witch trials, things like that? Was it really sort of in your face, or was it kind of subdued?
I would say it was a fair mix, like a mixed bag. I grew up in a small town outside of Boston, very Christian growing up, Catholic. My family was Catholic, they still are. And that type of stuff wasn't really looked upon kindly, if you catch my drift. Yeah, you'd have a couple ladies going to see tarot readers or whatnot, but they would never want to associate themselves with what they called the dark side. But it was just a very ignorant view of what witchcraft is all about. But as for the whole witch trials thing, being fairly local to, because Salem's like 30 minutes away, it wasn't until maybe fifth grade, because we actually took a field trip to the Salem Witch Museum. And we went through the whole exhibit. And I don't know if you've ever gone there, but
I haven't been yet. I've been dying to go.
Okay, so when you go, do you mind if I give you a little?
Yeah, go ahead. I love spoilers. I'm so weird.
So I don't know if it's changed since, because it's been a long time since I stepped in the Salem Witch Museum, because I feel like I've read enough, even for this book, to be like, yeah, why do we have to go to the Witch Museum for again? But there is a circle on the floor of all the victims' names in 1692. Now, when my mom went many, many years before that, she said, oh, it's a big pentagram on the floor. And then when I went, it was just like a stained glass, glowing red. And there were dioramas all around depicting different parts of the Salem witch trials timeline and things that happened. The daughters that were involved, like they had the fits, and then there was one with Tituba, there was one with Giles Corey being pressed to death. More weight, he would say that. He's very famous for that. And then after that, they would take you through a hallway of sorts. It was its own exhibit, like talking about modern witches and witches in Hollywood. They had the green faced witch from the Wizard of Oz hanging up. There was another one talking about Wicca with, now it looking back, how I remember it, it looked more like a high priest and priestess, not the actual deities of Wicca, which is usually depicted as a horned god and a moon goddess. But they both looked like they were just regular old Wiccan priest and priestess. Then after that, we went through a gift shop and then made our way out. But going back to how immersed I was growing up in it. So 5th grade, we had the field trip. But it was also around that time, or maybe even slightly before, I started feeling a sense of like, hey, maybe I'm a little different in this way. I've always felt a bit different, but this is kind of when I became cognizant of it. It was before I started having psychic phenomena. I was about middle school when I had that. It was prophetic dreams. I was about 11 or 12 years old. And I started officially practicing when I was about 12, around the same time. But yeah, we would read about the trials and stuff throughout school. I didn't really know too much about the other New England witch trials because there was some in Connecticut. There were even more in Massachusetts because Massachusetts was very Puritan. They were still under the British crown to the extent that any of King James' laws were here, and witchcraft was punished very harshly in Massachusetts compared to some other states. Maine didn't necessarily have witch trials. New Hampshire maybe had a couple of accused witches, Eunice Cole being one. I'm not sure if you read about that part. Her story was really interesting. She was more of a neighborhood Karen than anything. Connecticut had a couple. They even had this vampire hysteria back in the 1800s. What was her name? Mercy Brown. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Basically, they had tuberculosis. That was the explanation for it. But they thought they were vampires because when they were dead and buried for X amount of weeks, their blood looks fresh still. That really interested me. I think Rhode Island might have had a couple. Yeah. I didn't really know about those witch trials until fairly recently, until right before revamping my book for the last time during COVID. But then I also discovered in my own family tree, I went back to the whole Salem witch trials thing again because I am actually a descendant of the Towne family. And the Towne family, so Rebecca Nurse, Mary Easty, Sarah Cloyce, they were all victims in the trials. And they were all sisters. Their mother, Joanna Blessing, they came from Yarmouth in about the early 1630s, and they settled in Topsfield. My fiance and I actually had the privilege of going to the old town land. So there is, if you ever visit Topsfield, Mass, there is a memorial sort of for the Towne family because that was their land. They bordered with the Putnams. They're also a big name in the witch trials. Joanna Blessing, their mother, actually was accused around 1670, but it was unsubstantiated, so she never went to trial. But Rebecca Nurse is actually my 11th great-grandmother. And Mary Easty, she was also killed in the trials. Sarah Cloyce, they say that she either escaped or she got released. But that's another connection that I've had to the witch trials that I've discovered in recent years. And yeah, so I think that's my answer overall. I hope I answered it concisely, considering that it was kind of a mixed bag growing up, living around that history.
Absolutely. And, I was going to ask you to kind of dive into the witch trials that happened around New England that weren't just in Salem, because I didn't really know anything about that until I read this book. Very ignorant of me, I know. But, it's not really talked about a lot, is the stuff that was going on outside of Salem. And it got me curious, and I started looking up. I live in Pennsylvania now, but I'm originally from Maryland, and we have a couple, not a lot. We only have about 2 or 3 confirmed accusations of witchcraft around this time. But did you ever look into other states and their trials during that time?
Other states. So as I mentioned, Connecticut, had its vampire craze back in the 1800s. It's still connected to witch trials because the common theme with witch trials is hysteria. And there's been so many different types of hysteria over the years, but that's just one example. You don't mind if I refer to the book for specific
No,
names?
not at all. I mean, I have the book right here, so I'll probably be referring to it a lot.
All right, that's New Hampshire. That's so like the Hartford witch trials. That lasted over 20 years on and off. There was Catherine Harrison. She was mainly a target because she skipped church. She did fortune telling, was said to practice so-called black magic, which to the British colonists, black magic literally just meant on the darker side of things, hexes, curses, maleficia, things like that. And they also had their white practitioners who did things for healing and to remove those things. They were both just kind of an essential part of the ecosystem, if you catch my drift. Predator and prey, vice versa. So that's just kind of my views on the whole black magic thing. She was also accused of astrally projecting. That was also a major theme in the New England witch trials, was the ability to astral project. We also see this in Salem as well. Oh yeah, her spirit came to torment me in my sleep, kind of like a night hag or hag riding. We see this throughout European witch folklore and for hundreds of years up until this point. So this was an established form of evidence. It's called spectral evidence. And sometimes that was used to convict a witch. It was the be-all, end-all. Hey, no, you're being sent to the gallows if multiple people are saying that you're out of your body, torturing them. Let's see. Who else? It was actually the very first large-scale witch trials in the New England colonies was in Connecticut because it lasted for so long, 20 years. There was, in 1647, there was Alice Young. She was in a position to inherit her late husband's land. And we often see with witch trials, especially in Salem, they pointed fingers. And if you were deemed a witch, that meant that you lost all of your civil rights, even your right to own property. Everything was taken away from you once that label was smacked on you. This, again, it happened with many of the victims. And then there was also a couple of the victims. What was it? I think Sarah Good was the one who she was actually a beggar. And you either were rich or you were a beggar. There was nothing in between. You could be, it's kind of like extremes on the spectrum. If you were either of those extremes, you were more likely to be labeled as a witch. Or if you had too many children or no children, you couldn't win. But yes, so Connecticut. Her own daughter was actually accused of witchcraft in Springfield, Mass, because she actually fled Connecticut after her mom was implicated in the Connecticut witch trials. Then there was Mary Johnson in 1648 in Wethersfield, Connecticut. She was whipped by the minister for being accused of practicing witchcraft. There was actually accusations that she'd had sex with the devil. That's another dimension to witch trials throughout Europe as well as in the Americas, that you were familiar with the devil in that way, because intimacy was seen as something holy within marriage, especially in Christianity. So if you deviated from this, you were probably a witch. Or if you did things that weren't considered normal for the time, you were probably considered a witch too. So it made you more likely. She was even accused of killing a child. So yes, she was hung in 1650. Those are a couple of the specific examples from Connecticut in my book. Then there's also Eunice Cole from New Hampshire. Again, a neighborhood Karen. Her and her husband came from England. They got land up there. And she was a target for witchcraft because she got angry very easily. She even bit the constable that was trying to take her away. She bit him. Yeah, and she was accused of having a familiar because her neighbors would hear cats scratching at the windows. She was apparently not a very nice person, so she kind of lived up to her name. But the funny thing is, she wasn't actually hanged or anything for witchcraft. She died very poor, She was actually buried in a very bizarre way. Legend has it she was buried with a stake in her heart and a horseshoe over her to prevent her spirit from going to haunt the townsfolk. But then it was in the 1930s, the Goody Coal Society in New Hampshire, they actually exonerated her posthumously, a day late and a dollar short, right? And they have a stone up in New Hampshire in her honor. They don't know where Eunice Cole is buried. Oftentimes, a witch would not be buried in a churchyard with the rest of the folks. They would be buried at a crossroads or in an unmarked grave somewhere because they didn't even want them near the town. There was just so much fear around them, So let's see. In Maine, they didn't have any witch trials, but it was actually a legend about a colonel's grave. Let me actually pull that up here. Colonel Jonathan Buck. He was involved in a trial of a woman who was accused of witchcraft, so the legend says. She was sentenced to hang, but then she cursed him, supposedly, and that she would one day dance on his grave. And in 1795, now this was about 100 years after the Salem witch trials, and important to note, Maine was actually part of Massachusetts at one point. So looking back when I was writing this book, because of that geographical distinction that Maine was part of Massachusetts, and maybe that's why there aren't any specific witch trials that are recorded to have happened in Maine as we know it, because again, it was part of Massachusetts and a big state and everything. So there was like a shape of a foot forming on his tombstone. It was scrubbed off, but then it would only come back. But it just kept coming back every time they tried to sand it off, wash it off. And they didn't have any witchcraft trials there, but again, they still believed in it because primarily English colonists, but a lot of the French were up in Maine, still are today. They'll speak French up there in some parts. Let's see. Yeah, and Rhode Island actually was a bit more tolerant when it came to, let me actually just double check the book here that I wrote here. So, let's see. Yeah, so Rhode Island was one of those states, rare for the time, obviously, that they did not really discriminate religious-wise. So there weren't really any witch trials there. But yeah, so those are a couple of the different witches that were accused in different New England states.
Awesome. And was there any kind of record that you found that showed that there was actual witchcraft being performed, that some of these allegations maybe not were justified, but that there was something going on? Or were these women just purely accused for being women? And, because there's a lot of speculation nowadays about it just being a very anti-woman movement with misogyny and things like that, and that there was no actual magic being performed. And I'm curious, in your research, did you find any kind of records, journals, things like that?
Well, I would say, like, for example, in the Salem witch trials, I think it was Bridget Bishop. She was actually found with poppets, and she was one of the accused that was sentenced to death, unfortunately. But it's weird because these very Puritans would practice apotropaic magic themselves. Witch bottles, they would put nails, needles, their own urine in the bottles, put it under the threshold or in the chimney to keep witches away. So they were pretty much doing this stuff, but they didn't really see anything wrong with it because they're like, oh yeah, no, witchcraft is actually when you hurt someone. But Bridget Bishop had this doll for protection, and yeah, she was killed over that. But then there was another one who was the midwife. Mind if I just refer back to this? Yeah, Massachusetts. Oh yeah, so Margaret Jones in Charlestown. That is a little north of Boston. It's a suburb of Boston now. She was a midwife who practiced medicine, and practicing medicine was a no-no for women during that time. This was a little bit of both here. So she knew folk charms. She knew how to use herbs to heal people, whereas doctors were using mercury and bloodletting. She actually knew how to do her job. She knew that these other things were no good. So she wasn't just targeted because she was a woman. She was targeted because she actually did this stuff. A lot of these folk charms and a lot of these things that would have otherwise branded her as a witch And let's see. And of course, there were a couple of them where, they were just targeted for being rich. There was that other one from Connecticut who was in a position to inherit her husband's land. Again, she would have lost all of that, and it probably would have gone to someone else who wanted it if she was deemed a witch. So that would definitely be my answer to this. Some of them are baseless, like my ancestor, Joanna Blessing Towne, unsubstantiated just because the Putnams wanted her land. And she was an old woman, but oh yeah, she's probably going to die anyway. We'll just deem her a witch and take her land. And then there's people like this midwife who actually did this stuff and actually knew how to do her job. So that's definitely my answer to that.
Okay, that's really interesting because like I said, growing up, I always heard, they weren't actually witches; they were just targeted for being women. It was that society at the time, and I know that the ergot explanation was kind of around for a long time. I think it only just got kind of debunked in the last few years.
Yeah, I heard about that actually.
Yeah, which I think is interesting because one of the things that I realized, the way that I came into magic, and my listeners have heard this story 1,000 times, so I'll give you the cliff notes. Basically, I've always been into the occult as a kind of an armchair researcher, and I enjoyed the aesthetics and things like that, and I did a little bit here and there. But when I was 25, I had a really, really intense mushroom trip that kind of like broke my brain for a number of years. And it kind of was like, okay, reality's not real, but magic is. So, go for it. And, I got started with that and the podcast. And what I kind of realized very quickly was that magic works within reality. And these substances and things like that, just because you're under the influence of something doesn't mean that there isn't real magic happening alongside with it. And so I always found it interesting when people would say, oh, well, it's not magic, it's hallucinogens. Well, what's the difference? Are they really that, what's the separation there? And I'm curious.
And as a matter of fact, a lot of those said hallucinogens were thought to be in the witch's flying ointment in early modern Europe. So they can't really go off and say, oh yeah, it's not magic. A lot of them were used for shamanic journeys. It was a particular mushroom used in pre-Christian, I think it was pre-Christian Russia or Siberia.
Oh, the Amanita muscaria? Yeah.
Yes, Amanita muscaria. In fact, if you've ever seen the movie The Northman, I love that movie. I could rave about it all day. But you remember the scene where Olga the sorceress, now she's enslaved by the guy's uncle, and she's taken from, I actually think it's modern day Ukraine. She put Amanita muscaria in the soup that was served to everybody. And then everybody just started having trips, stabbing their throats, everything. And it just kind of made me think of that. But that's always been used. Now, things like, I don't know off the top of my head, alcohol might open you up a little bit, but over time it can dull you. It can dull your psychic senses. It can do certain things to you that you're like, oh my God, what am I doing to myself? Because anything, and too much of anything is poison.
Exactly. Especially, alcohol is a poison. So, yeah. I'm curious if you looked into, so I live in York County, and the big thing with witchcraft around here was the powwow doctors and the brokeri, specifically Nelson Raymeyer. I don't know if you looked into that at all.
Those are the Pennsylvania Dutch, Amish, right? Mm-hmm. I'll be frank, I'm not too familiar with the exact practices other than the fact that they put symbols on their barns for protection of the animals.
Yeah. So it's basically just Christian folk healing magic. That's in essence what it is. But there was a guy who was very good at it, and then there was another guy who wasn't very good at it, and he just kind of was bad at everything. He was bad at his crops always failed, his farm animals always failed, and this is in recent history. This is in like the late 1800s. He goes to a local witch who is known as the River Witch of Marietta. Very, very fascinating character. There's supposed to be a book coming out on her very, very soon that I'm really excited about, because one of the things that I like to do is I'm very big on sort of working with the ancestors of witchcraft in your local area. And luckily, I have two very big ones here. So went to this witch. She told him that this guy cursed him and he went and killed him. There's a much more to that story, but if you ever want a good documentary, I recommend the stuff about him and that whole situation, because it was really interesting.
They'll definitely have to send that to me after. I'd love to
Absolutely. So one of the things that I really liked about this was that you kind of go through the traditional forms of witchcraft, you know, the witch father and the witch mother and the spirits and things like that. And I'm curious about the area that you worked in, the glade that you worked in. What has that been like for you? What kind of experiences have you had with the spirits there that have kind of influenced this book?
Feeling very welcomed, feeling very authentic, especially going to university in Salem was actually the very first time in my life that I ever felt like I could be my authentic self. Not just because Salem was very welcoming to witches, but the spirits just made me feel a sense of belonging. Like I had gone to, I wrote about this in a blog for Cross Crow recently. I went to explore the nature in the area. It was on the other end of a bike path. And I immediately, do you know that intuitive pull to a place? You can't explain it. There's really no words for it. That's kind of how I felt in this glade. I walked there. It just felt so energetically open. It just felt right. Like the trees are just standing guard. It was like a clearing. There was actually a couple of tree stumps there. One of the tree stumps actually served as my altar for a time whenever I went outside. And I remember the first season that I was doing stuff there, the black and white candle wax for my very first ritual stayed there until the spring. Yeah. And it survived a harsh winter. It survived freaking crap being thrown all over it. Sometimes I'm going in the glade and there'd be trash everywhere because maybe college kids or some hoodlums, they go in and they have no respect for things. I remember one of the last times I went there was trash everywhere. I was like, shoot. And then I kind of heard something like, oh, shoot, I didn't bring an offering. What could I do? And it's almost like they were telling me, hey, could you pick up this trash, please? We really can't stand looking at it. So that's what I did. I picked up all the trash. I carried it all the way out of the woods and I threw it away in the nearest trash can and sometimes an offering isn't so much what you can bring. Like usually people will bring liquor, spirits, baked goods. And if you're really drawn to it, some of your own blood, but sometimes it's an act of service. And that was like an act of service there. They're like, okay. And this was actually after I had done something, and not actually in the glade, but near it, because this particular working, I was like, no, I can't bring this energy into the glade. I just can't. So it was kind of like an offering after that. Because usually you give offerings after you do spell work or ritual or even laying to rest certain materia after the fact for a spell, like you're burying something, you're putting something there for the land to just take and the spirits do what they want with, say, your target or your goal, so to speak. But yeah, overall, it's made me feel very welcome. There's a marsh kind of near where I grew up. I'd be bitten by mosquitoes constantly. And again, mosquitoes are spirits of that place. And they'll say, oh, yeah, you have sweet meat. Yeah. I'm like, no. I've never been bitten by mosquitoes that much in one visit. Even with heavy pants on, they still got me. They were more selfish, more taking, more parasitic. Needless to say, I don't really go in that marsh anymore. And then that's when I realized I was like, no, this is the glade is where I feel more at home. The glade is where I feel more like myself. It's a symbiotic relationship between me and those spirits of that land. So it's actually around that time after visiting the marsh, then coming to this realization, I'm like, oh my God, that manuscript I've had on hold for X amount of years, I'm just going to pay homage to the glade with the book. And again, build a world around that and talk about my different experiences until this point.
Yeah, that is so cool. And it really resonated with me because I do a lot of stuff outside. And I have an area in Maryland. You know, I lived in Maryland for most of my life. I just moved up here this year, but I have a few areas in Maryland that I would do a lot of workings in. And this one area, it was the way that I would describe it is it was very welcoming to me, but the way that it showed that was a mixed bag because sometimes it was a very nice, pleasant feeling. And then other times, I mean, I got charged by a deer there once while I was doing a ritual. I mean, I kind of asked for it because the ritual was involving Hecate and more of like a, you know, I want to feel your presence. And so, you know, delighting in deer, let me just kind of shove my face in it.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I've been followed by things that I couldn't see, you know, so the entities there have definitely shown the full range of emotion that they have while I've been doing stuff. And that is just a signal to me that, you know, I'm doing something right because I'm getting a reaction, I'm getting a response. And I've done a lot of workings there that have all been more or less successful. And then I've been into areas where you just didn't get anything. It just felt very sterile. Not that there isn't anything there, but they're not interacting with you. They don't want to interact with you.
Right.
And, you know, I used to get very frustrated when I was younger about that because I felt like, you know, I'm doing all the things that I'm supposed to be doing. I'm doing the things that these books are saying, and I'm not getting anything. And then you realize that these are entities with their own feelings, emotions, agendas, and wants and needs, and they're going to do what they're going to do. And there's no way to calculate when you're going to get their attention or how or what, you know, if. And so one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, you know, when I feel that this book, it's very much directing the reader to go out into the world and perform magic in the world. And one of the issues that I've had moving up here is that if it's not like a county park or a state park, it's private property.
Yeah.
And it becomes very difficult to find an area where you can go at night and feel safe. And I'm curious if you've come into that, if you've had any kind of, if that's been an obstacle for you over the years of working, is trying to find areas that you can feel safe and secure while also being out in nature.
Yeah. So other than that sense of belonging that I felt in this particular glade, yes, I have run into that. People hiking through the woods on a trail that was there. And I'd just be there in the middle of the woods, just doing whatever. And then I'd have some guy, Joe Schmo, on his bike riding by, like just staring at me like, what the heck is that? I'm like, and then I'm just projecting out, like, keep going and mind your own business. This is not going to end well for you. and sort of like that dramatic horror movie kind of thing. But it's just a means of protection. I wouldn't actually hurt the guy. But it's also a means of keeping focus as well. Like, let me focus, leave me alone. You see a witch working, leave me alone. Yeah, that's happened quite a bit. Or then you'd stumble upon it. Yeah, I'd have the private property problem sometimes. And I'm like, oh crap, I can't go here. So what do I do now? And then sometimes I'll just resort to just doing it at my altar at home, you know, because that is a place. Now, doing magic outside is fantastic. But if you have an altar in your home, a designated place to commune with the spirits, to commune with deities, and to perform spell work, that's great, especially considering the fact that the spirit world is a vast expanse. You can call up spirits from anywhere in the world. I have done it. Somebody could be buried in Europe, but you can. It's obviously better if you're near or in vicinity of said person's grave, for example, or have something that belongs to them, but you can still evoke them from anywhere in the world. It's kind of like there are different demons for different continents. For example, if you've ever read the Goetia, that doesn't mean that you can just evoke that demon in that continent. You can evoke them anywhere in the world. So this kind of goes hand in hand with what I'm saying, that the spirit world is a vast expanse. You know, you can astral project pretty much anywhere. You could go to Hong Kong. You could go to London in your astral flights, or even in your dreams if you're able to do it through your dreams. And having that altar is kind of like it is a place for the vast expanse and the physical world to meet. I definitely believe that the realms of spirit and form are enmeshed with each other.
Yeah, and I absolutely feel that it kind of overlays on our reality.
Yes.
And I have a whole room that's dedicated to my different spirits with different altars in them and things like that. And it's very nice to have that. I realize that not everyone can have that, so you got to kind of work with what you have. And even if it's just a little corner in your room, it's something.
Right.
Going back to the original witch trials and the history of it all, one of the things that people love to talk about, and I'm a very big fan of the Isabel Gowdy situation and what was going on with her. And when I was reading the historical aspect of the book, I was curious, would there have been any communication between the people dealing with the Isabel Gowdy situation in Scotland, communicating with the rulership of New England at the time and saying like, hey, we got this stuff going on here. You might want to check it out over here and see, was there any kind of communication like that, or was it very separate?
Could you rephrase the question? I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah. So there was probably communication between the colonies and, England and Scotland from where people were coming from. And I'm curious about when the Isabel Gowdy stuff was going on and the American witch trials were going on. Was there any kind of comparison or sort of note comparison between those two events that would have influenced each other, if that makes sense?
Honestly, I think there was, because King James was King of England. So he was King of Scotland from the time he was a baby. But in 1603, when Queen Elizabeth I passed away, she left no heirs. She never married, famously called the Virgin Queen. King James took the throne of England, thus starting the Stuart dynasty. And he was very harsh on witches during his entire reign. He actually took part in torturing some himself. When he went back to his wife, Queen Anne, back to her homeland of Denmark with her and back, the whole voyage was riddled with storms. And guess who he blamed? Witches. Let me see. Was it Agnes Sampson he actually accused directly of doing that? And she was just literally a midwife in Scotland, minding her own business. And then she got caught in the crossfire when was accused of things. And yes, she did use folk charms as well to heal the sick. Because usually if you were a midwife, you did regular health care for the village because doctors were very, very expensive. One of those class divides, I would say, usually went to your local midwife or healer if you were not a nobleman, because you'd have your own doctor usually. But yeah, I would definitely say that there was some type of communication because he ruled both lands. What he said went, and his laws went to the New World with those colonists. The very colonists / Puritans, pilgrims that were trying to get away from him. They still had to bring his laws to the new land, even if they didn't follow quite the same religion as he did. In fact, in my book, I wrote about this a little bit. One sec, let me get it up here. So in 1636, there was one law that was dictated that anyone who made a compact with the devil through the means of witchcraft would be sentenced to death. And it was actually based on a royal charter that was brought to the New World, but it was amended for the colonies because, again, it's not quite England. But you know how the colonies did all that stuff. They had to amend things for the New World, but it was the same thing. In Massachusetts, especially where these pilgrims landed, very harsh punishments, as I said earlier. Very harsh punishments. You would lose your land, you would lose your titles, you would lose everything. Your whole family would turn against you. It was not a good time to be a witch. And there was Laurie Cabot, who I greatly admire. She was actually one of my very early inspirations in my personal craft, and still is to this day. She actually had said something about the trials, if I'm not mistaken. She said they wouldn't know what a witch was. They didn't actually know what it was all about. A lot of it was ignorance. But yeah, I would say that due to the fact that there was King James between the two lands, there was definitely some type of communication. He wanted to eradicate witches. He felt very threatened by them no matter where they were. He just wanted them gone.
No, I totally understand. And it's really cool because I was curious about that while I was reading. I wonder, it's around the same time period, obviously same subject matter. So
Right.
But yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course.
One of the things that I really want to talk about, we got about 15 minutes left,
Sure.
and you bring it up in the book, which I'm so glad you did, is the perception of spirits and the feeling like, we're working with spirits, but we can't feel them, we can't see them, we can't, it's difficult to get a direct interaction, and that can feel very, very disheartening for people just getting started. And
Yes.
I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that and the methods and how your feelings about that in the book.
So we all perceive spirits differently. It's funny because my fiance always jokes with me. Now, he's not a practitioner, but he's very open to the stuff. And he has actually said, "Oh, yeah, I'm more open to the stuff now than I ever have been." But he's always asking me, "Why won't ghosts talk to me?" Now, he is a big horror fan. Yeah, and he's always talking about it in that context. I'm like, yeah, it's not always quite what you think it is. A lot of people think spirits will just talk to them, kind of like you and I are talking right now. But the truth is, if a spirit seems to have a lot to say, it's probably not who you're looking for. They're probably a trickster. And this is especially true with the dead. The dead, there was one time I was at my altar, just talking to, as I actually participate in a lot of ancestral veneration as well. And his came through, one of his great grandparents or grandparents. All I could see, and I knew it was him, as I'd seen him in pictures too, but I knew it was him, but he was just nodding. He didn't really have much to say, but he was nodding, like he understood. It's either that or it's a lot of one-word stuff, especially whenever I've done ancestral stuff for my Samhain rituals. They'll sometimes speak their own language to me. I've had one speak in Italian to me, very, very simple, but I was able to reply back. It's my second language. Yeah, very simplistic communication. A lot of people will think that spirits move things around them. Not always. In my family home, so it was my grandparents' house. Now it's my parents' house. So I'm sorry, I have to count how many generations have lived here. Four generations now have lived here. And there's been a picture of, say, my uncle falling down. My uncle passed away going on 20 years ago. His photo would fall down, and it was in a place where it was there, like just fixed for a long period of time. It wasn't like we'd moved it or anything. Doors would shut automatically. Yeah, it can happen, but not always. Sometimes I'll feel spirits behind me. I've noticed them definitely on my left side. I've been in readings with clients. There was one in particular. Her significant other had passed away. I could feel him looming over my shoulder as I was on the phone with this client. I'm like, "Hey, got something to say to you." Now, I did not make any guarantees that this person was going to come through to me, as I never have with any of my sessions, because I wasn't really a working medium, because the way I interact with the dead is more of a necromancy turn, so to speak, a little more ritualistic, a little more true to life. In fact, I've actually had people appear to me as though they had just died, half their head blown off, or jaundice with their stomach distended. I had a client in Canada I was reading for, and she was asking about someone that had died, and he appeared to me in the exact condition as he did when he passed away. And it's not for the faint of heart. When people say mediums, I notice a lot of mediums, especially on TV, they'll just picture or paint the picture of someone that passed away in a very like positive sort of light. Like, "Oh yeah, I could smell their perfume," or whatever. Yeah, hell, I can smell my Nana's perfume. Big deal. But did you actually see them as though they had just died and maybe got reanimated? Yeah, that's disturbing. So I guess that's another thing, going back to what people expect this to be. Sometimes it's more disturbing. You may feel like you need a therapist after, which I don't blame you. Hey, if you haven't seen this stuff in real life or in the field or whatever, I don't blame you. If you need counseling after seeing that, get it. And then there's also the idea that, oh yeah, if you hear spirits, you're probably schizophrenic or have some issues. This was actually something I talked about on my Instagram a while ago. I made a reel about mental health and witchcraft, mental health in the context of spiritual phenomena, psychic abilities. My distinction is if you hear voices telling you to go in the street and get hit by a truck, that's not spiritual. You should probably check yourself into a hospital for your own sake. Get some help. Because the distinction here is psychic phenomena, hearing spirits is usually more helpful. I've actually had it where like I would be walking down the street. I'm like, shoot, where do I go from here? I'm a little lost. I'd hear like, no, don't go in that direction. But in a very subtle roundabout way, I'd be sort of walking towards the I'd have the gut feeling, and then I hear it be like, don't go there, don't go there. And then the more I step, don't go there. I'm like, okay, fine, I get it. I'll turn around. Jesus. But yeah, it's not really what people expect it to be. Let me actually refer back to the chapter and see what else I can address here to answer your question. Or actually, you know what? I'll let you ask me a question based on something specific from that chapter, if you'd like.
Okay, sure. Let me just go ahead and okay. Divination as a method of contact.
Yes.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about that and kind of what your experience has been with that. You know, one of the things that I have been really into is tarot, obviously, but I've also been getting into pendulum stuff. And that pendulum is so interesting because it requires, I can get it to move pretty fluidly. Right. And, if I ask a question and it gives me an answer, I don't usually stop it. I just ask another question and it'll change directions. And that is a big indicator that I'm talking to something. But I think trust in your spirits and knowing that you're talking to something that you want to be talking to with that is really important. Right. And I'm curious about your experiences with that.
So spirits in the context of divination. So I have been a professional tarot reader for a long time. I've recently taken a indefinite hiatus. So I can really only speak from like clients I've had or any personal readings I've had. Again, like that example with the woman, her significant other looming over me. Sometimes the dead will know things that the living do not. Either that's wisdom gained from being on the other side, being wherever we go, or things that they knew in life but never told anybody. That stuff is very valuable, especially, and sometimes you do have to work for it. It's kind of like prying open one of those you remember the scene from Titanic where they pulled up the vault and they find Rose's picture and yeah. Did you see how hard that was to pry open? It's kind of like that if I had to compare it to something. And sometimes you have to build a relationship with a spirit in order to get that type of information. But then you also don't want it to come across as, oh, I'm only using the spirit for information. Because sometimes, just like the living, the spirit will feel like, oh my God, you just used me. And then they'll shut you down entirely, cut you off. Definitely don't want to do that. Definitely still keep them around and be friendly. Yeah.
Right. And that's what I always tell like paranormal investigators and ghost hunters is like, you just going into a house one night and trying to get all this activity. I mean, you might get something, but you're going to get a lot better results if you go in there like a couple nights a week for a couple weeks and,
yes.
build a relationship. Yes. And that's, one of the things about the show that I wanted it to be was a way of showing how magic and the paranormal can be interacted and sort of, yes. Work together. And that is one of the big ones is forming a relationship with the spirits you're trying to contact instead of just, running in there with your EVP machines and stuff like that, trying to get results. I mean, because at the end of the day, you're trying to get evidence for something that no one's going to believe you anyway. A bunch of, pictures and voices are not going to prove the afterlife. So it's much better to go in for the experience of it and, for yourself than trying to prove it to the exterior world.
Yes. And that's a fantastic point. And this book actually it's not just for beginners, but it's for people that are more advanced that just want another perspective as well. One of the big things with beginners, they want to show off what they can do. They want to prove that they can do things. But life is not like that. Like, who are you trying to impress? Are you doing this for you? Are you doing this for some sense of external validation? Well, it's better for you to do it for you, not prove to yourself that you could do things. And then there's actually a tenet I actually wrote about this in the book, The Witch's Pyramid. It originates in ceremonial magic, Crowley. Four Pillars of the Temple is another term for it, but it's been adapted to modern witchcraft. One of the tenets is to keep silent. Keeping silent isn't just, hey, be still and listen. Keep silent because of the sanctity of it all, the sanctity of magic itself, and also for your own safety. Many times before, like with the witch trials and that time period, there was a lot of dual faith practitioners in Scotland and England. You can even see this in Gemma Gary's work. Any of those types of authors. In fact, her book, The Charm of Psalter, is a perfect testimony of this, because a Psalter is a book of Psalms, which is used in magic, and each Psalm has a correspondence if you do dual faith. A lot of them had to practice Christianity in order to literally survive. They had to adapt. Like, oh yeah, no, okay, I have to be a Christian to fit into society, but I don't really fit into society. I am a peller or a cunning woman or man. I have to practice magic somehow. So that was another part of, like, oh yeah, being silent. But then the people who knew, yeah, sometimes they knew and kept their mouths shut. Other people were neighborhood Karens and threatened to report them to the authorities or whatever. But yeah, it's very important to just be true to yourself and not make up your own things within reason. Even if you have teachers that are teaching you, I would, even with my students, I'm like, look, don't take my word as gospel. Read, practice, get out there and do things. And that's partially the goal of this book, is to encourage people to do that and to read beyond what they think that they should be reading about. Yeah, start with what you're interested in, but don't ever get caught up in proving to people what you can do. Chances are they don't care, or they don't believe you, or you're going to get yourself in a heap of trouble.
Exactly. Exactly.
So.
And that is a beautiful place to stop. I want to thank you so much for coming on. Before you go, are you working on a sequel or anything else at the moment, or do you have any plans to?
A sequel? Well, not really. I've actually kind of put my writing on hold a little bit, but I've been writing blogs for Cross Crow. I would like to write another book in the future. Well, you know what? I'd be lying if I said that I didn't start an outline already, but I'm going to keep it under wraps for now, just until I get my footing with it and like, okay, is this really what I want this book to be about?
Absolutely. And where can people find more about you and, any social media or anything like that?
Okay, so on Instagram, I'm pretty big on there. Pretty active, not big. I don't have a crap ton of followers, but Realm of Spirit Official, you can find me on there. There's also realmofspirit.com. That's my website. I also have a TikTok. I'm also on YouTube. In fact, if you find my website, just realmofspirit.com, which, spoiler alert, I am going to be revamping it in the next couple months, so it won't be up for too long. But if you're able to find my social medias on there, they're all on the top of the page. My YouTube, my Instagram, my Facebook page, my TikTok, all of those things. The name is pretty similar across the board. Just look up Kelley Towne and I'm there.
Awesome. Well, I will post all that in the show notes. So again, I really enjoyed this. This is an amazing book, Stone in the Glade. You can get it now on Cross Crow, Amazon, everywhere you get books. Kelley, thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure as well. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And that was our interview with Kelley Towne. Really loved having Kelley on. Really great conversation. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this. All of our social media will be in the show notes below. I highly encourage you to get Stones in the Glade and check out any of her other services. As always, this is Octavian Graves, and I will see you again in the Strange Dominions.